Now, when he was a chief economist at the African Development Bank, Mthuli Ncube, who is now a finance minister in Zimbabwe, gave a talk at one of the World Economic Forum meetings in Cape Town, where he was emphasizing why including women in the economy made economic sense. Fast track 5 years on, where are South Africa's women in the economic, social and political life of this country? In the studio with me is Mandisa Khanyile, Director at Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence. And that's where we should begin, right?
By the economy.
By the violence.
Of course. Look.
Because if I am threatened, if I am beat, if I am told I should behave in a certain way, I am not going to express myself socially, politically, economically. I'm a prisoner, isn't it?
100%. I think safety is always an issue. I don't think humans can function properly outside of an environment where they feel safe to do so. And violence against women, especially in South Africa specifically, is at crisis level. We are currently experiencing a femicide. It's not fiction, it's backed by numbers and stats.
You're now using big words, femicide. Help me understand.
Basically, a genocide of the women of this country.
Right.
But
you
at
would
the hands,
characterize it
yes,
as such.
at the hands of their intimate partners. If you look at it as per global standard, I mean, gender-based violence globally affects per 100,000, 120 to 130 people. In South Africa, it's 250,000 women.
More than double.
So it's more than double the world standard. That's a fact. And then we're just talking about reported cases. We're not talking about the ones that get murdered in the bush and never get recorded. Or we're not talking about the ones that never decide to actually go and open a case against their spouses or their other intimate partners. We're just talking about the ones that are documented.
Yeah. To what extent do you think that hinders the ability of women to be active economic participants in the country?
If you're afraid of, for example, if I'm in a home where I'm expected to always be at home at 5 o'clock, cooked, ready, kids in bed, etc., etc. If I have a work environment that for me to develop, I would need to put in the extra work and the extra effort. Obviously, that immediately becomes a factor. If I work shift work and get beaten up every time I work night shift, that becomes a factor. If I want to be an entrepreneur and I want to be able to go out and open my own shebeen and work odd hours, and I have someone who has an expectation that at 6 o'clock they must get their dinner.
And there must be no men in there. Anyway.
Exactly. And if I'm seen speaking to my patrons, I find myself with a blue eye. What do you think ends up happening there? But I mean, we need to also talk about the fact that even excluding women from the economy is a form of violence in its own.
It is, absolutely, because you're depriving them of their economic right to be making a living within their own skill set. What scares me is that you're giving me these numbers. These are 2018 numbers.
Yes.
25 years into South Africa's, 24 years if we go back to last year, into South Africa's democracy. In a country where the constitution has been hailed as one of the best in terms of conferring the rights of people. Which begs the question, what needs to be done to be able to get these numbers down in terms of the violence and to get the numbers in terms of the participation of the women up?
Firstly, I'm huge on social behavioral change programs. I'll give you a very big example because South Africa's done this before with HIV/AIDS. Remember back in the 90s when there was so much misinformation around HIV/AIDS, etc., that we were just bombarded. Every single billboard, every single television station, everything was talking about how to prevent HIV, how do you get HIV, how to transmit HIV. Everyone and their kid knew what to do because we were given that information. There are few pockets of social behavioral change programs that are trying to address gender-based violence, but they're not prioritized. And we need to have a broad-based 365-day campaign against gender-based violence in this country. That one is a non-negotiable. Secondly, we need to actually put our monies where our mouths are. Do you know that we currently don't have a national strategic plan against gender-based violence? We don't have one. It's currently being developed by the interim structure, the interim gender council that was developed after the gender summit that took place in November. So up until now, we were just sitting there with no plan, knowing that we have a crisis, no budget allocation, no department that's in charge of it, basically on some like women will sort themselves out, no one is interested. So we need a costed national strategic plan against gender-based violence, because obviously if it's not costed, then it's not going to happen.
Sure.
So for me, those are the two biggest priorities.
Absolutely. So when you look at the campaigning in these elections, we are voting, of course, today. Do you see any party that actively is working to try to ensure that, one, it addresses the issues we are talking about, and secondly, there's a credible plan that aims to bring women as key ingredients in the economic revival of this country? Okay.
So there's two political parties that I think have done slightly better than the rest in terms of the conversation around gender-based violence specifically and the rights of women. And it's not through their own doing, it's through the work of activists and civil society formations and the documents that they drafted. What they did is that they essentially just copied and pasted them into their manifestos, some even verbatim. Specifically, the African National Congress took the 5 key asks of the Gender Summit, took a copy and pasted it onto their manifesto document, which is great. If they actually plan on doing the implementation work, then 100% then we should back them. There's also Women Forward. They've also decided that they're going to adopt the 24 demand and the 5 key asks, etc. And they've added that into their manifesto ask as well.
This is a party?
Women Forward, it's a party, yes.
They're
contesting
there are
both.
48 of them.
Yeah, but they're contesting both provincial and national elections. And it's not their first time contesting, but this year they've really taken to the streets and campaigned for women's issues. So those are the two parties that I've seen have stood out in terms of paperwork, policy, and the advocacy
at least thinking
work.
About it,
having the conversations, and putting it forward. The others have not been as strong. They have been talking about the economy, land issues for women, economic empowerment for women. I've seen that in almost every single manifesto of all the political parties. That's what has been their focus. They've been like, look, we'll deal with the violence later. Let's give women a means to support themselves, because the thinking is if you can support yourself, it doesn't put you in the hands of a violent partner.
You don't need to go to that guy for you to be able to have a better life.
There's some positives in that, but then there's also misinformation. There's plenty of women living in big houses, driving humongous cars, having huge careers that are covering bruises with foundation. So that's not... It's not a be-all, end-all fix for gender-based violence to make sure that a woman has her own money.
Covering bruises with foundations. Wow, incredible. What about the other 2 political parties that you haven't mentioned, which we know, of course, we've got 3 big political parties. You have mentioned the African National Congress. What you haven't mentioned is the position of the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition in the previous election, and the Economic Freedom Fighters.
The Economic Freedom Fighters have said that they want to start having young women-led, how can I put it? They want to be young women-led. They want, since young women are specifically the bulk of the South African population, right? They want their party to reflect that. And they've done that in the form of putting a few key women on their lists and said that that's representation. However, I'm not really seeing that messaging coming from their manifesto. I'm definitely not seeing it in terms of their implementation. I'm definitely not seeing it in their current speak, in their current practice, in what they promote in Parliament. I'm not seeing it. It's seeming to me that it's just one of those things that they want to rubber stamp and say, we said we did this, and here's our 1 or 2, 5 token people that we're going to push forward and say that this is actually something that we believe in. But their focus is more on the economy. They're the economic freedom fighters, which is fine. But that's where their focus lies. They're not necessarily trying to delve deep into those issues. The Democratic Alliance...
Interesting.
They have a very capitalistic type view on how they'd like to address this issue. Also, similarly speaking to the economic question of women, how women should be empowered, etc., etc. But not really addressing any of the drivers for gender-based violence
Yeah.
or actually trying to seek any real solutions. So I've found both of them a little bit weak.
Yeah.
And I found them saying, well, we've got one or two women and they can champion these issues. Sort of, it's like it's a woman's problem, go sort it out.
Yeah.
And not saying let's work together in actually trying to end the scourge.
Which is interesting for me, because when you look at the Democratic Alliance, for instance, it's not as if it's short of strong women.
Not at
because
all.
we have seen, of course, Helen Zille, premier of the party, leader of the party,
Patricia
premier of the
DeLille.
West case, Patricia DeLille, what's her name, the young lady?
Lindiwe.
Lindiwe Mazibuko. And yet, at the same time, those women, when they've gotten to those positions, have not been seen to be championing the cause of women. I mean, a classic example is, of course, the case of Helen Zille herself. Her cabinet dominated by males when she was premier.
But then do you also want to talk about how the DA actually elects people into positions of power? Unlike other political parties that actually go through the branch system and decide through branches to go to a Congress and have representatives, you submitted CV in the DA.
Sure. And then somebody judges and says,
the panel
yes
decides
or
that
no.
you are qualified and you meet the criteria.
Yeah.
So in a patriarchal society, how do you think that's going to end up looking?
And then you want to look
White
at, of course, at that panel.
Exactly. It's going to end up
100%.
looking white male. So I'm not saying that the DA has produced some incredibly powerful, strong women.
Yeah.
And they've had to push their way to the top against all odds.
Yeah.
But I'm not seeing at ground level them encouraging women leadership, them speaking behind women leadership, them trying to put women at the front. I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing the political will.
Absolutely. I am speaking here to Mandisa Khanyile, Director of Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence, and we're talking about women in the context of these elections. Now, of course, South African women make up 55% of the voting population. However, the female voice, as she has been saying, is seldom heard, with women being one of the most marginalized groups in this society. Our reporter, Bevashni Naika, filed this report.
This is Denai Mapotsa, a professor in the study of gender and women at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Her first name on the door, Love One Another, a contrast to the lives of many women in South Africa who find love is in short supply.
My name is Denai Mapotsa. I was born in 1983. I was born in Harare at Mbuyane Handa Hospital. I started off as a biochemistry major. I was pre-medical. But I would sit in these classrooms and people would say things like, the African bee is more violent than the European bee. And I was like, well, that's a bit strange. Where do these conceptions come from? Or the fact that I had never read a book written by a black person or a woman in my high school curriculum. Those were questions I had. So for my first semester in a liberal arts college, I took an intro to women's studies course because I was like, I would be curious to know what women think. And I took a course in Africana studies because I was curious to know what African people have thought, because those were not central to the curriculum. The Africa section of my history exam was an option we could take in high school. And it was an option if you wanted to do it, you had to go see Mrs. Lutalo on the weekend, and then she would teach you that section of the exam. So I was taught that it was peripheral to what is universal or world history. So I took those courses out of an interest to ask questions about the kind of lack or missing parts of the curriculums that I experienced.
The statistics say it's rough for women in South Africa. Denai is 5 times more likely to be killed here than any other country in the world. A woman is murdered every 4 hours by the hands of a partner. Yet, in this election, women should have the whip hand. According to Stats SA, of the 26 million South Africans eligible to vote, more than 55% are women. On top of this, more women than men turn out to vote.
I think it's important for women to vote because it was one of the first ways women articulated a claim for freedom. It was recognizing that there are certain forms of political power and decision-making and women not being included. The right to vote, as one of the kinds of goals and aims of anti-colonial movements around the world, was one of the spaces around which women could mobilize and articulate feminist demands in anti-colonial movements. Again, kind of lack of a gender lens, lack of a feminist lens has been disastrous across the continent for women, and it's assumed to be progressive. And yet there's a lot of assumptions about what real politics is, and so the question of gender always is pushed aside as like the soft things. We need to just, men's like, if we can just be better men, we can just grow ourselves and change, and then things will be better, or we can be stronger women. I'm like, no, we actually need substantive, critical feminist lenses that are actually thinking across all levels of policy that this is a question of gender. This many women members of voters is not substantive, that you actually need technical expertise, you need institutional forms of change, you can't privilege particular forms of voicing an authority, and that requires hard work, but it also requires actually having a substantive commitment to questions of justice and not just the political life of your party. I would say the system of the state, the nation state, and its assumption that freedom is through democracy, through representative democracy and the liberal individual rights, that is only one tiny little version of what a category of freedom is. And it doesn't have a capacity to understand the conditions of freedom and constraint that most of us engage in our everyday experiences.
But the South African political parties still believe in the power of policies to change the world for women for the better.
Let's deal with courts. We've been saying, can we have courts that deal with gender-based violence so women don't go through the same courts as the normal court systems? The police is critical and service delivery is critical. And people might think service delivery is a small thing, but putting floodlights in an informal settlement helps women to feel a bit more safer because they can see the toilets at night when they have to go. And that will help to reduce that kind of violence against women. The secondly is we need to uplift CPFs in communities. The CPF has an act, but it's not followed properly. So you find the police are working in isolation. The empowerment of the CPF in the community structures level is not there. And that will help make women more safer within our communities.
Gender-based violence is one of our key areas of focus. And we have gone to the extent of suggesting castration to serial rapists. And we say that without flinching, because the numbers of women who are being raped, who are killed on a regular basis is unfathomable. It's just too much. Until we come with countermeasures. Prison system in South Africa is not working. Well, it's not prison actually. We're talking about correctional services. Correctional services is not prison in South Africa, and I think that's where the problem lies. Because most of the perpetrators are the people who'd rather be in jail than outside, because they've said it many times. Some of them are like, I'd rather be inside than outside because it's very hard outside. And it's important for us as Women Forward to actually attack the correctional services system and say, because we spend about 11,000 rands looking after a prisoner, do you know that? Yet we paid 340 rands for a grant. Imagine somebody who has abused that woman who has been left as a victim and the children, but he's in prison, he's living a beautiful life.
Denai Mapotsa remains skeptical.
This weird thing it yanks at you because anti-colonial movements attach so much value on the vote, that I think that optimism that things get better doesn't always go away. But it's a kind of really naive optimism, because there's very little evidence to show us that this works. I think the dehumanizing conditions we live in, I don't think they enable us to have the kinds of empathy that it takes for that political will to be substantive, to reshape the worlds that we're living in. And so we need something else, another form of thinking about what is the political, that isn't simply embedded in a fantasy that the nation is going to save us. It's not.
Women may be the majority at the polls, but women make up a mere 41% of cabinet. A world away from 30 years ago, but change is slow for strident women in Africa like Denai Mapotsa. Vavashni Naika, CNBC Africa, Johannesburg.
Thank you, Bevashni. We continue our coverage of South Africa's elections 2019, and we continue our discussion on the role of women and how the political parties have framed discussions around including more women into this economy. And in the studio with me, let me remind you again, if you're joining us now, I have Mandisa Khanyile, Director, Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence. Thanks, Mandisa, for staying with us. So during the break, we kept on talking about how when you look at women's issues, you see the prevalence of violence against women, and yet, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have one of the strongest constitutions in terms of the protection of the rights of the people in this country. How to square the whole, if you like, in terms of having that framework of a very strong constitution that protects rights, but at the same time having the highest rate of gender-based violence?
I blame three things: institutionalized patriarchy, lack of political
Don't
will.
look at me. Why are you looking at
No,
me?
no, no. Well, you happen to be a man. Institutionalized patriarchy,
Yeah.
lack of political will, and absolute failure at implementation. We have brilliant policy in this country. And if we actually were to implement what we have on paper
Yeah.
and existing laws,
Yeah.
I don't think we'd be here.
Whose
We
fault
were
is it that
discussing
that
this with
implementation
you
is
during the
not there?
break that, for example, the prescribed minimum sentence for rape in this country is life.
Yeah.
But no one ever gets a life sentence for rape. You can
Sure.
rape
I
a
was trying to
4-year-old,
check,
a
actually.
2-month-old, a 3-year-old. It doesn't matter. No, the judges in this country are just not willing to take it that far. The magistrates in this country are not willing to take it that far. So consistent, they need to be consistent in the implementation of their own sentencing legislation.
Sure.
So if they actually were to follow the guidelines and the policies and the laws that we have in this country, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Yeah. Would you go so far as to say perhaps so even making it stiffer would not help? In other words, hanging rapists
It
would
won't
not
help.
solve any
I mean,
problem.
who's okay? If we're saying we're going to hang rapists,
Yeah.
when we are failing to give them life sentences when it's the prescribed minimum sentence, who's going to give them those verdicts?
Whose fault is it that you've got that situation where you have a law that says you can do this, and you have got learned judges, let me put it that way, who are sitting in the courts and still you're not getting implementation?
I think.
Are you not making enough noise?
Well, I don't think we're making enough noise.
Right.
I think as civil society we've made a lot of noise.
Yeah.
We've made a lot of noise. We've taken this country quite far as civil society. I mean, from campaigns such as Stop GBV to try and get the costed National Strategic Plan to different organizations. I mean, currently we've got the Total Shutdown, Strice Fuba, so many different civil society formations that have done so much in terms of ensuring that the right policy frameworks are in place and the advocacy work is done.
Yeah.
But do we all have the time, the ability, the space, the resources to be at every single courthouse when there's a rape case?
Maybe not.
I mean, let's look at the Dross rape case, classic example. How many times has that been postponed?
Yeah, okay, all right. I've got a solution though. I'm suggesting to you, Khanyile, that perhaps given the activist platform hasn't quite worked, would it work if there was a political party formed on the basis of fighting for women's rights that contested elections?
There already is.
Who?
Women Forward.
And?
They've already done that. But what I'm saying is that are they in power? No. What we need is accountability mechanisms. I don't think this can be solved by a political party.
It's not.
I think we need to have actual accountability mechanisms where if you go and as a judge and you don't give a prescribed minimum sentence for something that's been outlined, there needs to be some kind of consequence for that.
Yeah.
If you're a police officer and you decide that you're going to turn away a survivor of domestic violence and say that she needs to go sort it out with her husband, there needs to be real proper consequences for doing that.
Yeah.
Right now you might get a slap on the wrist from IPID. That is probably as far as it goes. I need to start seeing job losses. I need to start seeing people sentenced for negligence. Those type of harsh measures where there's actual accountability mechanisms put in place. That's where I think we need to be headed. And that's not going to be something that's going to be run by a specific political party.
But perhaps the political will is not there, and that's why you continue having this problem.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I do think that there is some lack of political will.
Yeah.
But then if there was no political will, we wouldn't have all this beautiful policy. That's their job, is to create policies, right? And to create frameworks.
Yeah.
And we just had the discussion that we've got stellar policy and stellar frameworks.
Yeah.
So the issue now is accountability, and remember what I said from the beginning, implementation. We suck at implementation as a country generally. I don't even have a better word to use than suck, because that's the situation.
Absolutely. Condemnation. I can't answer you, so I'm going to have to end this discussion right here. Mandisa, thank you. Mandisa Khanyile Director, Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence.